Okay, I'm just feeling the need today to share some crazy random stories that I've read about authors in the last week. No topic to this video, just the craziest stories I heard. First of all, let's talk about Patricia Highsmith, the author of The Talented Mr. Ripley. Did you know that she was obsessed with snails? I mean, obsessed. She had 300 in her back garden in England, and in one notable incident, she took about 100 of them inside of her handbag, along with a head of lettuce, to a cocktail party. I mean, I'm just saying, I hope that they weren't serving escargot there. And eventually, she did move from England to France, and when she did, obviously customs wouldn't let her bring a bunch of snails through, so she smuggled her beloved pets in her bra. She was only able to fit about 20 though, so that was a lot of guys left behind. She loved snails so much that she ended up writing a short story called The Snail Watcher, which I'm about to spoil, so you have been warned. In it, a snail enthusiast has about 30 glass terrariums full of snails that he's studying. At some point, he has to take a couple weeks off from his study, and when he returns, they have copiously mated and overtaken his entire room. He is consequently smothered and strangled by these snails, and he dies. He swallowed a snail, Highsmith wrote. Choking, he widened his mouth for air and felt a snail crawl over his lips onto his tongue. He was in hell. He could feel them gliding over his legs like a gluttonous river, pinning his legs to the floor. Ugh! Mr. Noppert's breath came in feeble gasps. His vision grew black, a horrible, undulating black. Let's move on to something much happier, like Anthony Burgess's brain tumor. Misdiagnosed brain tumor. It was 1960 and Burgess got diagnosed with a brain tumor and a year to live. He began furiously writing in hopes that the royalties from his novels would help bring financial stability to his wife after he was gone. Which makes perfect sense because writing is historically such a steady and lucrative way to make money. Anyway, he wrote 5 novels that year, including A Clockwork Orange. He then went on to write a total of 33 novels and 25 nonfiction books as he outlived his wife and his improper diagnosis. Even though he had that huge body of work, A Clockwork Orange remains his most famous novel, likely because of the Stanley Kubrick adaptation to film. I'm realizing now this video is not full of the most heartwarming stories, but let's continue. In 1863, Fyodor Dostoevsky found himself addicted to roulette and almost completely broke from gambling binges in Europe. He wrote to his brother on September 8th, 1863, and said, "And I believed in my system. Within a quarter of an hour, I won 600 francs. This whetted my appetite. Suddenly, I started to lose. Couldn't control myself and lost everything." He was so desperate for cash that he ended up making a merciless deal with a publisher in 1866 to finish a novel by the end of the year. If he failed to meet this deadline, he was to give up all of his compensation and all of his rights to his work for the next 9 years. So what do you think he wrote about? He wrote a story called The Gambler about a Russian man who gets addicted to roulette while traveling through Europe. Sound familiar? He wrote the entire thing in 26 days to fulfill his contract. Is that just the way with writers? To not write at all and then just completely binge write an entire novel? Because that's what happened with Jack Kerouac and On the Road. Even though he had formulated the ideas, he wrote that novel in a manic 3 weeks. And perhaps most interestingly, he typed really fast. And he hated changing the paper in his typewriter. It took him out of the flow. He hated it. So, being the creative person that he was, he ended up taping together a bunch of different pages until he had a 120-foot scroll. Problem solved. Speaking of long, artist Elon Manwalk bound together the pages of a popular Japanese manga called One Piece. He wanted to create a single sculpture that spoke on the commodification of comic books. When he was done, he had created a book that was 21,400 pages long and 37.5 pounds, making it the longest book in the world, but also making it physically impossible to read. The first woman to win the Pulitzer was Edith Wharton in 1921 for her novel The Age of Innocence. It was just the 4th year of the prize's existence, but it was not a win without controversy. It turns out that the award was supposed to go to Sinclair Lewis for his novel Main Street. That was who the jury picked. However, Columbia's advisory board had final say, and they said, "No way, this doesn't fit the wholesome requirement for the prize," and they awarded it to Edith Wharton. In 1926, Sinclair Lewis actually did win the award for his novel Aerosmith, but he refused to accept it. But not so fast, because it turns out that the Pulitzer doesn't care if the author doesn't accept the award because the book wins the award, not the author. So they came back and told Sinclair Lewis if he didn't want to collect the money, that was his own prerogative, but he was still the winner. So even though he didn't accept the money, his novel is still the 1926 Pulitzer Prize winner. Speaking of awards, Rudyard Kipling was the youngest person to win the Nobel laureate for literature at just 42. Doris Lessing was the oldest at 88. Which, did you know that the Nobel Prize awards like a $1 million prize? I had no idea it was that high. It varies slightly year by year, but when Doris Lessing won in 2007, she was awarded $1.6 million. Actually, she technically won 10 million Swedish krona because it is given by the Swedish Academy. And I know this has nothing to do with books, but when Obama won the Nobel Prize for strengthening international diplomacy in 2009, he was just 8 months into his presidency, which made him vastly uncomfortable with the win and made it pretty controversial. But he actually ended up donating his entire $1.4 million prize to multiple charities, which I just thought was pretty cool. So at least we can end today's video on a happy note. I'll catch you on the next one.